They said the West was wild, and we believed them. Tales of gunslingers, white-hatted heroes, and lawless frontier towns. But what if much of it was never true? Today, we're dusting off 30 of the dumbest Wild West facts folks still believe, to uncover what is fact and what is mere movie. Every cowboy carried six-shooter. You've seen it 1,000 times. The cowboy sauntering into town, revolver swinging at his side, ready for a gunfight. But in truth, that six-shooter was more fantasy than fact. Most cowboys weren't gunslingers. They were cowhands, working long days in the dust, more focused on cattle than showdowns. A heavy pistol wasn't only expensive, it got in the way. Try mending a fence with iron strapped to your waist, and you'll see why most left it behind. Many ranches banned sidearms entirely, and when weapons were used, it was usually a rifle or shotgun, tools for predators, not duels. What dangled from their belts? Ropes, hammers, a pocket knife. But Hollywood needed drama. So they gave us standoffs and quick draws, swapping grit for spectacle. Truth is, the real cowboy had more calluses than cartridges. Stetson hats for every cowboy. We've been told for years that no real cowboy ever stepped into the sun without his trusty Stetson. The movies made it gospel, wide-brimmed, high-crowned, and worn like a badge of honor. But that familiar silhouette? That came later. On the actual trails of the American West, hats came in all shapes and stories. Many a cowboy tipped a bowler, not a Stetson. They wore what they had: Civil War kepis, Mexican sombreros, even caps that looked better suited for a Boston newsboy than a cattle drive. The original Stetson, called the Boss of the Plains, was modest, flat-brimmed, round-crowned, more practical than iconic. So how did the Stetson become the crown jewel of cowboy lore? Credit the Showman, Buffalo Bill, dime novels, and later, the silver screen, all needed a symbol you could spot from the back row. And over time, the Stetson became shorthand for the cowboy himself. Rugged, upright, a man of action. Not because it was common, but because it looked the part. High noon duels were common. Did cowboys really square off in the dusty street at high noon, waiting for a clock to strike before drawing their guns? That image, so familiar from the silver screen, owes far more to Hollywood than to history. In truth, these choreographed duels, with silent crowds and dramatic stares, were rarer than a saloon with cold beer. What did happen, more often than not, was chaos. Gunfights erupted without warning, usually fueled by whiskey and bad tempers. Arguments in gambling halls turned deadly fast, and nobody stood still in the open waiting to be shot. They ducked, scrambled, and fired from behind barrels, doors, or whatever cover they could find. The word gunslinger wasn't even around during the real Old West. It was coined decades later when movie studios needed a title for their heroes in black and white. Still, the image stuck. Because it looked good, because it worked on screen, and because legend always finds a way to outshine fact. Cowboys fought Native Americans. Western films have often shown cowboys in constant conflict with native tribes, rifles raised, arrows flying. But when you look into actual history, the story changes. Cowboys weren't soldiers, they were cattlemen, hired to move herds through dust and heat, focused more on bad weather and stray animals than confrontations. Conflicts involving Native American communities did occur, but these were primarily the result of military campaigns carried out under federal direction. These efforts were driven by government expansion, not cattle work. The average ranch hand was trying to finish the season in one piece, and hopefully get paid. So how did the myth take hold? It came from dime novels and movie scripts, which needed drama, clear roles, and simple visuals. Feathers on one side, spurs on the other. That image stuck because it made for good cinema. But the day-to-day life on the trail was far less cinematic and far more ordinary. All cowboys were white. You wouldn't know it from the old westerns, but the real cowboys of the American frontier looked a whole lot different than Hollywood ever showed. The silver screen gave us square-jawed white men riding into the sunset, while the truth, richer and far more human, was quietly pushed aside. After the Civil War, the open ranges were filled with men chasing a new beginning. A quarter of them were black, many once enslaved, now guiding cattle instead of plows. And nearly a third were Hispanic, vaqueros from Mexico, who didn't just herd the cattle, they taught the trade itself. Their gear, their skills, even the words, lasso, rodeo, chaps, came from them. Add to that, Native Americans, Chinese immigrants, and others who took up the trail, and you've got a picture far more honest and far more American than the old movies ever gave us. But the early storytellers had other ideas. They painted with a narrow brush, casting only one kind of hero. The rest were left at the edge of the frame, waiting to be remembered. Which Wild West myth did you believe for years before learning the truth? Let us know in the comments. Cowboys owned loyal steeds. What cowboy tale would be complete without that noble steed, the faithful companion galloping beside him through danger and dust? That's how the movies told it anyway. But the trail reality was far less sentimental. Out on the range, most cowboys didn't own the horses beneath them. Those animals, more often than not, belonged to the ranch, loaned out for the day's ride, returned at dusk like a worn-out tool. And they weren't the towering, gallant stallions you see on the big screen either. They were smaller, tough-as-nails ponies, chosen for stamina, not swagger. They zigzagged through brush, held steady on uneven ground, and knew the rhythm of cattle better than most greenhorns ever could. Yet the story of the cowboy and his devoted horse stuck around, maybe because we like to believe in lifelong bonds, even if the saddle belonged to someone else. After all, a tale of borrowed horses and tired backs just doesn't sing as sweet as two silhouettes riding into the sunset, side by side. Western towns were lawless. According to the movies, every frontier town was a powder keg, saloons shaking with brawls, streets echoing with gunfire, and outlaws calling the shots. But step away from the screen, and you'll find something far less dramatic. The truth is, most Western towns worked hard to keep the peace. Folks who built homes and raised families wanted law, not chaos. Sure, a few boomtowns born overnight beside gold mines or railroads had rough patches, but across the West, laws were passed, sheriffs were sworn in, and curfews were posted on the church door. In fact, many towns had strict rules about carrying firearms. Visitors were often required to check their guns at the edge of town. And before governments got around to organizing, everyday citizens formed their own groups to settle disputes and keep order. It wasn't perfect, but it was far from anarchy. Of course, Hollywood preferred mayhem, because quiet streets and cooperative neighbors don't make for thrilling plots, but they do make for better places to live. Cowboy Job Was Glamorous. Was life in the saddle really filled with gunfights and gallantry, riding hard, saving damsels, and outdrawing desperados before supper? Not exactly. What most cowhands faced was sun-bleached hardship, where the glamour wore off faster than the soles of their boots. Their days dragged on, dusty, grueling, and relentless, pushing cattle through unforgiving terrain, enduring hail, heat, and hunger. Pay was pitiful, often less than $1 a day, and the rewards didn't stretch far beyond a bunkhouse bed and the chance at a hot plate of beans. Their worries didn't center on outlaws, but stampedes, snakebite, and a misstep by a horse. And out on the trail, with wind and hoofbeats for company, a man could drift far from any glory. Popular fiction skipped the slow grind. It replaced hours of monotony with gunsmoke and heroics. After all, in a dime novel, No one froze, starved, or got trampled by a startled steer. Clean-shaven cowboy heroes. In those old westerns, cowboys always looked neat as a pin, faces smooth as church marble, not a hair out of place after weeks in the wild. But that, my friend, is a Hollywood fairy tale with a straight razor. Out on the range, where water was rationed and mirrors were scarce, shaving wasn't part of the morning routine. It wasn't even considered. Most cowboys wore the day on their face. Dust, sweat, and stubble were part of the uniform. Beards, scruffy cheeks, and grand mustaches that curled at the edges were far more common. Their clothes? Usually whatever was cheap, rugged, and could outlast a thunderstorm and a cranky mule. Yes, they might clean up once they rolled into town, but on the trail, their appearance had more in common with drifters than with leading men. That polished image, tight jawlines and spotless collars, came later when studios realized grit didn't sell tickets, but glamour sure did. Cowboys were tall figures. Ever picture every cowboy as a towering 6-footer with shoulders as wide as a barn door? You're not alone. Blame it on the movie posters. But the men who actually worked the range, who rose before daylight, wrangled cattle, and rode for miles over hard ground, looked a whole lot different. In reality, most cowboys were on the shorter side, often no taller than 5'5" and rarely over 150 pounds. That wasn't a flaw. It was a strength. A lighter rider meant less strain on a pony and more stamina in the saddle. Those wiry frames could endure the aches of long trail drives and the jarring rhythm of a galloping horse day after day. They looked more like jockeys than screen idols, but they got the job done. Hollywood, of course, preferred its heroes tall, stoic, and oversized. And so, the myth grew, larger than life, but not quite as tough as the real thing. If you enjoyed uncovering the truth behind these Western legends, go ahead and give this video a like, and subscribe for more stories that set the record straight. Saloon brawls were epic and common. Saloons weren't exactly churches, but they weren't demolition zones either. Sure, tempers flared, especially after a few too many drinks or a losing hand at poker, but the all-out brawls that sent men flying through windows and chairs, splintering in midair, that's mostly Hollywood shaking the rafters. In truth, bar fights back then were short, sharp, and often over by the time the piano man noticed. Owners had every reason to keep peace. Broken furniture cost money, and trouble meant fewer paying customers. That's why many saloons posted rules, banned guns at the door, or hired someone with broad shoulders and a quicker draw than most to keep order. Yes, a fist might fly, or a bottle might break, but the legendary chaos, with bodies crashing over balconies and swinging from chandeliers, came from the minds of screenwriters. It made for great cinema, but in real saloons, the dust settled fast, without much left to clean. Gunfight at the OK Corral happened in the OK Corral. You've heard the name 100 times, the gunfight at the OK Corral, but the real shootout. It didn't take place inside the corral at all. On that October day in 1881, the action unfolded in a cramped lot beside a photography studio, just down the alley from the corral's fence line in Tombstone, Arizona. Not quite the wide-open street brawl we picture, and certainly not the sweeping, dusty showdown made famous on film. The whole thing lasted half a minute. Quick, brutal, and messy. But gunfight next to a vacant lot near the corral doesn't roll off the tongue, does it? So the legend took the name that sounded better. And once Hollywood got hold of it, and Wyatt Earp's life got reimagined in print, the title stuck like a spur in dry leather. That's how history works sometimes. The facts get nudged aside, and the catchy version gets carved in stone, or at least in marquee lights. Six-shooters were accurate and powerful. Could those old six-shooters really pick off a villain from across the street with movie-style precision? Not quite. The truth is, most early revolvers, especially the black powder kind, were better at making smoke than hitting far-off targets. They fired heavy, slow-moving lead slugs, and anything beyond 50 feet was more about luck than aim. These pistols had charm, sure, but they also misfired, jammed, and sometimes posed more risk to the shooter than the target. That's why cowboys and lawmen alike leaned toward shotguns or rifles when the stakes were real. They wanted something that could hit a coyote or a rustler before it got too close. And as for those fancy tricks, like shooting a revolver clean out of a man's hand, that came from the pages of dime novels, not the streets of Tombstone. Lead didn't bounce off metal. It flattened or shattered. But Hollywood loved a sharp-eyed hero, so they gave him the kind of aim that only existed in the script. Train robberies were constant threats. The image of masked outlaws leaping onto speeding trains is one the movies never could resist. It had everything: smoke, steel, danger, and drama. But as thrilling as it looks on screen, it wasn't something passengers in the Old West lost sleep over each night. Train robberies did happen, mostly in the 1890s, but they were far from an everyday threat. Records show fewer than 1,000 incidents across 4 decades, roughly 20 a year, and not all of them happened in the West. Some were bungled attempts, others inside jobs, and most lacked the cinematic flair we've come to expect. Bank robberies, by comparison, were even less frequent, despite what every Western film from the 1950s might have you believe. What really cemented the legend was a short silent film in 1903, The Great Train Robbery, which etched the idea deep into our imagination. From then on, the screen became a lot more dangerous than the tracks ever were. Horses were the only method of transportation. If you judged history by old westerns, you'd think every soul west of the Mississippi rode everywhere on horseback, through prairie storms, mountain passes, and right into town. And while horses were indeed a cowboy's daily companion, they weren't the only wheels turning across the frontier. As the 1800s rolled forward, so did something with a lot more iron and a lot less hay: the railroad. By the 1870s and beyond, steel tracks stitched vast territories together, carrying settlers, goods, and dreams further and faster than any horse could manage. Earlier, stagecoaches rattled across the plains, hauling passengers and mail, bouncing through dust and axle-breaking roads. These weren't luxuries, but lifelines. Still, the image of a lone rider silhouetted against the sky endured. Not because it was typical, but because it captured the myth of rugged independence. Hollywood chose the poetry of hooves over the clatter of steel, and so the legend galloped ahead of reality on borrowed reins. Which do you prefer, the Hollywood cowboy or the historically accurate one? Sheriffs were corrupt or cowardly. Were most sheriffs nothing more than lapdogs for wealthy ranchers or bumbling fools afraid to act? That's how the movies often paint them: too scared to draw, too crooked to care. But real life along the frontier had little room for that kind of lawman. Communities needed someone who could stand tall when trouble rode into town, not someone ducking behind the saloon. Yes, a handful wore badges for the wrong reasons, and some groups, such as the early Texas Rangers, had serious stains on their record. But in many cases, sheriffs were steady hands in a restless land, men who broke up fights, hauled in drunks, and settled feuds without fanfare or reward. The image of the cowardly lawman served Hollywood well, especially when a loner needed to shine. But in most towns, real sheriffs were expected to act fast and face trouble head-on when violence erupted. Gold was lying around free. The movies would have you believe that every prospector in the West tripped over gold nuggets the size of potatoes, got rich by sundown, and rode off with pockets jingling. It's a fine story, and it makes for a shiny scene on screen. But the real gold rush was more mud than miracle. By the time most folks reached California, the easy pickings were long gone. What remained was backbreaking labor, sifting through silt, swinging picks, and hoping the next pan held more than sand. Most didn't find enough to cover the cost of their shovel. In a twist, it was the shopkeepers, those selling beans, boots, and blankets, who truly struck it rich. While the miners waded through disappointment, merchants watched profits grow. The image of sudden wealth endured. It had romance. It had luck. But for those who trudged west chasing a dream, gold wasn't gleaming in plain sight. It was buried beneath sweat, blisters, and dashed hopes. Vigilante justice was always pure and justified. How often did those citizen pauses truly serve justice and not something far murkier? We've been told they were righteous men, neighbors with pitchforks and conviction, rising up when the law was nowhere to be found. But once the dust of the legend clears, the picture changes. Vigilante groups did form, especially in towns where lawmen were scarce and law books thinner than a saddle blanket. But what they dealt wasn't always justice. Trials were hasty or non-existent, facts were flexible, and punishment came swinging from a rope. Personal grudges slipped easily into the mix, and fear had a way of looking like authority. Take the San Francisco Committee of Vigilance in 1856. Over 6,000 members, several hangings, and not a courtroom in sight. They didn't enforce the law, they replaced it. Swift justice might sound noble, but when fairness is swapped for fury, the difference between order and revenge becomes harder to pin down. Tumbleweeds were native to the West. A tumbleweed rolling through a dusty street seems made for the Old West, but it didn't originate there. That scraggly, wind-tossed plant in every Western movie actually came from Russia, likely hitching a ride in flaxseed shipments during the 1870s. Once on American soil, it spread like wildfire, fast, stubborn, and nearly impossible to contain. Early frontier towns, the ones laying the groundwork of the West, wouldn't have seen a single tumbleweed drifting past their saloons. But filmmakers wanted a symbol, for endings, for abandonment, for a landscape where motion outlasts people, so this foreign weed earned its spot in countless final frames. Today, multiple invasive species of salsola roam the open plains, not because they're native, but because they're relentless, dramatic, and hard to look away from. It didn't start as Western iconography, but in the hands of storytellers, it rolled straight into myth. The Wild West was exclusively male-dominated. It's easy to think women in the Old West stood quietly in the background, tied to bar stools or balconies, waiting for cowboys to rescue them. But that version of the frontier leaves out the ones who were too busy building it to pose for the storybooks. Women didn't just pass through the West, they settled it. Nearly a third of all land claims under the Homestead Act were made by women, some traveling alone, others with children in tow. They carried mail through rough country, like Stagecoach Mary Fields, ran businesses, ranched land, and in more than a few cases, they carried rifles as well as reputations. Annie Oakley and Calamity Jane weren't exceptions, they were reminders. Some women disguised themselves as men, not to hide, but to work. Charlotte Parkhurst drove stagecoaches and voted before most women even dared. In fact, the Western frontier sometimes gave women more freedom than the cities back east. The old tales focused on gunslingers and gamblers, but many of the people shaping the West wore bonnets, boots, and grit in equal measure. White hat versus black hat was an old Western code. The idea that hat color in the Old West revealed a man's soul is a fine bit of fiction, but it was the camera, not the cowboy, that made it matter. On the screen, black hats meant trouble, and white ones meant honor. But out on the trail, your hat said more about sunburn and saddle dust than it did about good or evil. This tidy visual code, so handy for movie audiences, was born not on the prairie, but in Hollywood sound stages. In the days of black and white film, color contrast was king, and a quick glance needed to tell the crowd who to cheer and who to boo. Real cowboys picked their hats the way folks pick work boots, by what fit, what was cheap, and what didn't blow off in the wind. But the trope stuck, and stuck deep. So now, whenever the hero rides in wearing white felt, we nod knowingly. Never mind that in real life, he might have been wearing a bowler and badly needed a wash. The lone cowboy hero was the norm. That tale of the solitary cowboy riding into town with dust on his boots, righting wrongs alone, then vanishing into the sunset, is a story Americans have told themselves for generations. But out where the land was wide and the troubles even wider, survival rarely came one man at a time. The West was a patchwork of shared burdens. Cattle drives took crews of drovers working in unison, not lone riders chasing the horizon. Wagon trains needed teamwork just to stay moving, and mining camps ran on contracts, not chance. Settlers joined land clubs, neighbors shared tools and labor, and communities rose from many hands, not a single set of spurs. Still, the lone hero endures in fiction because he's simple, striking, and easy to root for. He doesn't need backup, just a horse and a good line of dialogue. But if the real West had been left to lone wolves, it wouldn't have lasted long. What built the frontier wasn't one man on horseback. It was the many who walked beside him. Native Americans were bloodthirsty savages. One of the most damaging myths ever told is the tale of Native Americans as ruthless attackers preying on defenseless settlers. That version spread fast, helped by dime novels, Wild West shows, and early films eager to sell a simple villain. The reality was more layered. Native societies included hundreds of unique nations, each with its own language, history, and customs. When violence occurred, it often stemmed from broken treaties, stolen territory, and efforts to protect communities, not from senseless brutality as Hollywood preferred to portray. The term Indian itself came from misidentification, an oversimplified label that erased generations of culture. Settlers and entertainers found it useful to paint native people as threats. It made westward expansion easier to justify. But this was never a tale of good versus evil. It was a history of resistance, displacement, and survival, too often rewritten by those who took the land instead of those who fought to keep it. Outlaws like Jesse James were Robin Hood figures. Does legend truly make Jesse James a hero who robbed with one hand and gave back with the other? It's a notion that stuck like saddle leather, helped along by penny papers and showmen who needed a tale as dramatic as a train heist. The truth, though, isn't quite so charitable. James and his gang did hit railroads and banks, often ones tied to Union forces or powerful interests he despised after the Civil War. But while he courted sympathy, there's no real proof that he ever passed his loot to struggling farmers or hungry families. Instead, he and his crew lived on what they took. They planned, ambushed, and, more often than not, killed to get away clean. That Robin Hood image? It's convenient, comforting, and entirely misleading. We like our outlaws with a streak of nobility, a reason to cheer them on. But Jesse James wasn't passing out bread loaves on dusty corners. He was a gunman with a cause, and a ledger that never balanced in favor of the poor. The Wild West era lasted for many decades. The belief that the Wild West stretched across the entire 19th century, wild and ungoverned, is more myth than map. Truth is, the golden age of the frontier was short, about 30 dusty, chaotic, and deeply complicated years. It began when the Civil War ended in 1865 and faded out by the 1890s. In that span, cattle drives thundered over open plains, outlaws made headlines, and the U.S. government pushed west with railroads, treaties, and guns. But by the turn of the century, that wide-open world had narrowed. Settlements grew into towns with brick courthouses and proper schools. The telegraph hummed, and rail lines tied the coasts together like shoelaces. Frederick Jackson Turner famously marked the closing of the frontier in 1893, but the stories didn't stop. They got bigger, louder, and more cinematic. That brief flicker of history became a roaring legend, replayed so often it began to feel eternal. Yet, in truth, the Wild West didn't last long. It just left behind one hell of a silhouette. 10 untangling hygiene practices in the Wild West. Can you believe it? Forget fancy bathrooms and toilet paper. Imagine a world where rivers were your face wash, corn cobs your bathroom tissue, and whiskey your medicine cabinet. That was the reality of hygiene in the Wild West. Bathwater sharing. The Wild West, a land of vast open spaces and rugged individualism, often conjures images of cowboys riding off into the sunset and pioneers forging new lives on the frontier. But beyond the adventurous facade lay a reality where even the simplest comforts, like a warm bath, were often out of reach for most people. Imagine a time when running water and indoor plumbing were considered luxuries reserved for the wealthy. For the average family in the Wild West, bathing was a laborious and infrequent affair. The process involved hauling water from a well or nearby river, heating it over a fire, and filling a tub, if you were fortunate enough to own one. The scarcity of bathtubs in the early days of the West meant that many families had to make do without. Even with the advent of mail-order catalogs in the late 19th century, which made bathtubs more accessible, the cost remained prohibitive for most. A Sears catalog tub, for example, would have set you back nearly $800 in today's money, a significant investment for families struggling to make ends meet. In households that did manage to acquire a bathtub, the precious bathwater was often shared among family members. This practice, while perhaps not appealing by today's standards, was a practical solution to the challenges of limited resources and the labor-intensive nature of bath time. The tradition of the Saturday night bath emerged as a way for families to make the most of their limited bathing opportunities. Everyone wanted to be clean and presentable for Sunday church services, so they would take turns bathing in the same tub of water, typically starting with the father and ending with the youngest child. While the thought of sharing bath water might seem unhygienic to us today, it's important to remember that standards of cleanliness were different in the 19th century. People were accustomed to living with less frequent bathing and different hygiene practices than we are today. The practice of sharing bathwater highlights the resourcefulness and adaptability of families in the Wild West. They made the most of what they had, finding ways to maintain a level of cleanliness and hygiene despite the challenges they faced. The story of bathwater sharing also provides a glimpse into the evolution of hygiene practices over time. As technology advanced and living standards improved, access to running water and indoor plumbing became more widespread, leading to a shift in bathing habits and a greater emphasis on personal hygiene. The next time you enjoy a long, hot shower or bath, take a moment to appreciate the conveniences we often take for granted, and remember the families of the Wild West who, despite limited resources, found ways to stay clean and maintain a sense of dignity in a challenging environment. Lysol, a risky solution. The Wild West, with its rugged landscapes and untamed spirit, often evokes images of adventure and freedom. But behind the romanticized facade lay a reality where access to proper health care was limited, and societal norms often shrouded personal health issues in secrecy. In this environment, misinformation and desperation could lead to dangerous practices, as evidenced by the shocking misuse of Lysol. Lysol, a product initially marketed as a disinfectant and cleaning agent, found its way into the most private aspects of women's lives in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In an era when open discussions about reproductive health were taboo, women facing various feminine health issues, including yeast infections and sexually transmitted infections, turned to Lysol as a desperate solution. driven by misleading advertisements that touted Lysol's germ-killing properties and societal pressures to maintain a facade of feminine hygiene. Women douched with Lysol, hoping to alleviate discomfort and address issues they couldn't openly discuss with doctors or even among themselves. Tragically, this practice was not only ineffective, but also incredibly dangerous. Lysol, in its original formulation, contained harsh chemicals like cresol and phenol, which are highly toxic and can cause severe irritation, burns, and even poisoning when used internally. In some cases, Lysol douching led to infertility, long-term health complications, and even death. The misuse of Lysol highlights several crucial aspects of life in the Wild West: limited access to health care and information. The vast distances and sparse population of the West meant that access to qualified doctors and reliable medical information was often limited. Women, particularly those in rural areas, had to rely on their own knowledge and resources, often leading to dangerous self-treatment practices. Societal stigma and silence surrounding women's health. Open discussions about reproductive and sexual health were considered taboo in the Victorian era, leaving women to grapple with their health concerns in isolation and without proper guidance. This silence created a breeding ground for misinformation and dangerous self-treatment methods. The power of advertising and marketing. Lysol's marketing campaigns played a significant role in promoting the product's supposed benefits for feminine hygiene, often using vague language and appealing to women's anxieties about cleanliness and social acceptability. This highlights the dangers of unregulated advertising and the importance of critical thinking when evaluating product claims. The story of Lysol's misuse in the Wild West serves as a stark reminder of the dark side of a seemingly glamorous era. It underscores the importance of access to accurate information, open communication about health issues, and the critical evaluation of marketing claims. It also serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of self-treatment and the potential consequences of relying on misinformation in the absence of reliable medical guidance. What surprised you the most about hygiene practices in the Wild West? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Creative toilet paper alternatives. Forget the convenience of soft, readily available toilet paper. For those who braved the frontier in the 19th century, bathroom necessities were a matter of improvisation and resourcefulness. Imagine yourself stepping into an outhouse in the Wild West. The air hangs heavy with the smell of, well, you get the picture. But as you reach for the toilet paper, you realize there isn't any. In the early days of the West, toilet paper as we know it simply didn't exist. So, what did people use? Well, they had to get creative. Corn cobs, one of the most common and readily available alternatives, was the humble corn cob. After removing the kernels, the cob's rough texture made it a somewhat functional, if not entirely comfortable, substitute for toilet paper. Nature provided another readily available option: leaves. Large, soft leaves from certain plants were used as a natural and biodegradable alternative. Newspapers and catalogs. As paper became more common, old newspapers and catalogs found a second life in the outhouse. People would tear pages into smaller pieces to use for cleaning up. Joseph Gaiety's medicated paper. In 1857, Joseph Gaiety introduced the first commercially available toilet paper in the United States. However, his medicated paper was sold as individual sheets, not in rolls, and it was relatively expensive. Roll-style toilet paper. It wasn't until the 1890s the toilet paper in roll form, along with the toilet paper holder, became available. However, widespread adoption of this modern convenience didn't truly take place until the 1920s. The story of toilet paper alternatives in the Wild West highlights the ingenuity and adaptability of those who lived on the frontier. They faced challenges that we can hardly imagine today and found creative solutions using the resources available to them. Outhouses, the unpleasant reality. The Wild West, often romanticized as a land of rugged individualism and daring adventures, also harbored a less glamorous side, one characterized by a constant battle against the elements and the challenges of basic survival. While Hollywood often focuses on gunslinging cowboys and saloon brawls, the reality of daily life in the 1800s West was far less glamorous, particularly when it came to the humble outhouse. Forget the modern convenience of indoor plumbing and climate-controlled bathrooms. For the pioneers and settlers who carved out a living in the untamed West, the outhouse was an unavoidable fixture of daily life. This simple, unassuming structure, typically a small wooden shed positioned a discreet distance from the main dwelling, served as the primary facility for relieving oneself. Stepping into an outhouse was an experience that assaulted the senses. The air hung thick with the pungent odor of human waste, a constant reminder of the outhouse's primary function. Flies buzzed incessantly, drawn to the unsanitary conditions, while other insects lurked in the shadows, adding to the overall sense of discomfort. The lack of modern amenities extended beyond the absence of flushing toilets and running water. Toilet paper, a staple in today's bathrooms, was a luxury unavailable to most in the early days of the West. Settlers had to resort to creative alternatives, using materials readily available in their surroundings. Leaves, corn cobs, and even clumps of grass served as makeshift toilet paper, offering a far less comfortable and hygienic experience. The outhouse experience was not just unpleasant, it posed significant health risks. The lack of proper sanitation contributed to the spread of diseases, particularly those transmitted through fecal matter. Water sources could easily become contaminated, leading to outbreaks of illnesses like cholera and typhoid fever. Beyond the physical discomfort and health hazards, the outhouse also represented a challenge to personal privacy and dignity. Located outdoors, and often shared by multiple individuals, the outhouse offered little in the way of seclusion. The lack of privacy was particularly challenging for women, who had to navigate the social norms of the time while attending to their basic needs. Despite its unpleasantness, the outhouse was an essential part of life in the Wild West. It served as a constant reminder of the hardships faced by those who ventured into the frontier, highlighting the stark contrast between the romanticized image of the West and the reality of daily life. By understanding the challenges posed by even the most basic necessities, we gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience and adaptability of the pioneers who built a life in the untamed West. The outhouse, a symbol of both necessity and discomfort, stands as a testament to their determination to overcome adversity and build a future in a land that demanded resourcefulness and grit. Infrequent showers and the consequences. While we might take daily showers for granted, for the pioneers and cowboys of the 19th century, bathing was an infrequent and often challenging affair. Surprisingly, this wasn't just due to a lack of resources or convenience. There was a prevailing belief at the time that frequent bathing could actually be detrimental to one's health. People believed that excessive washing could weaken the body's natural defenses, making it more susceptible to illness by opening up the pores to germs and disease. However, the primary reason for infrequent bathing was the scarcity of clean water. In the vast and arid landscapes of the West, finding a reliable source of clean water for drinking, let alone bathing, could be a daunting task. Pioneers and settlers often had to make do with limited water supplies, prioritizing drinking and cooking over personal hygiene. This reluctance to bathe frequently, combined with the harsh conditions of the Wild West, led to some rather unpleasant consequences. Cowboys, who often wore the same clothes for days or even weeks on end, were particularly susceptible to fungal infections. The combination of sweat, dirt, and infrequent washing created an ideal environment for these infections to thrive, leading to skin irritations, rashes, and other uncomfortable conditions. Imagine the plight of a cowboy after weeks on the trail, his clothes caked in dust and grime, his body covered in sweat and dirt. The lack of regular bathing not only led to physical discomfort, but also contributed to the spread of disease and infection. The story of infrequent showers in the Wild West highlights the challenges of maintaining hygiene in a frontier environment. It also sheds light on the evolving understanding of health and hygiene practices over time. As scientific knowledge advanced and access to resources improved, people began to recognize the importance of regular bathing in preventing disease and promoting overall health. River water facials. The image of the Wild West often conjures up visions of dusty trails, rugged cowboys, and saloons filled with boisterous laughter. However, beneath the adventurous veneer lay a reality far removed from the romanticized narratives, a world where basic hygiene was a constant struggle. For women in the 1800s, Wild West, maintaining even a semblance of cleanliness required ingenuity, resourcefulness, and a healthy dose of acceptance. Imagine yourself stepping into the worn leather boots of a pioneer woman. The sun rises, painting the vast expanse of the prairie in hues of orange and gold, but your day begins not with a steaming cup of coffee and a hot shower, but with a trip to the nearest river or stream. Forget your porcelain sink and fluffy towels. Your bathroom is the great outdoors, and your cleanser is the cool, clear water flowing from the heart of the land. These women understood the importance of cleanliness, even amidst the harsh realities of frontier life. They recognized that the relentless dust and grime, coupled with the scorching sun and relentless wind, could take a toll on their skin. Thus, the river became their daily sanctuary, a place to refresh and rejuvenate, to fight the elements and preserve a sense of dignity. Picture them at the water's edge, their faces tilted towards the sky as they cupped the life-giving liquid in their hands. They splashed the cool water onto their faces, gently rubbing away the accumulated dust and sweat. A moment of solace amidst the demands of a life lived on the edge of civilization. However, the idyllic image of a peaceful riverside ritual is tempered by the realities of the time. Privacy was a rare commodity in a world where settlements were small and resources were shared. Women often had to perform their ablutions in the presence of others, sacrificing personal comfort for the necessity of cleanliness. Moreover, full baths were a luxury reserved for special occasions or when circumstances allowed for a more secluded dip in a river or creek. The simple act of washing one's face with river water speaks volumes about the resilience and adaptability of women in the Wild West. They embraced the resources available to them, transforming a basic necessity into a moment of self-care and preservation. The river became more than just a source of water. It was a symbol of resilience, a reminder of their connection to the land, and a testament to their ability to find beauty even in the harshest environments. Furthermore, this practice sheds light on the broader sanitation challenges faced by those who braved the untamed West. Access to clean water was not always guaranteed, and the lack of proper sanitation facilities posed significant health risks. Waterborne diseases were a constant threat, and simple infections could quickly escalate into life-threatening situations. The story of river water facials is a reminder that the Wild West was not just a land of adventure and opportunity, but also a place of hardship and constant struggle. By understanding the daily routines and challenges faced by the women of this era, we gain a deeper appreciation for their strength, ingenuity, and determination. Their story is a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity, a spirit that thrives even in the face of adversity. Bug-infested beds. When we think of the Wild West, images of cowboys, saloons, and gunfights often come to mind. However, the reality of daily life for many pioneers and settlers was far less glamorous, especially when it came to the simple act of getting a good night's sleep. Forget plush mattresses and cozy comforters. For many in the 19th century West, the bed was a simple pile of straw or hay, often teeming with unwelcome guests. Imagine yourself stepping into a rustic cabin after a long day on the trail. The sun has set, casting long shadows across the rough-hewn walls. You're exhausted and ready for a well-deserved rest, but the bed awaiting you is far from inviting. Instead of a raised bed frame with a soft mattress, you find a mound of straw or hay piled directly on the floor. While it might offer a slight cushion compared to the hard-packed earth, comfort is hardly a priority. The main purpose of this makeshift bed is to provide a barrier between your weary body and the cold, damp ground. However, this simple bedding solution came with a significant drawback: bugs. Straw and hay, being natural materials, were ideal habitats for a variety of insects and critters. Fleas, lice, bedbugs, and other creepy crawlies found refuge within the straw, turning your bed into an all-you-can-eat buffet and a breeding ground for unwanted guests. Imagine trying to fall asleep with the constant rustling of insects in your bedding and the irritating sensation of bites on your skin. Restful sleep was a luxury that many in the Wild West could only dream of. The prevalence of bug-infested beds in the Wild West highlights the challenges of maintaining hygiene and sanitation in a frontier environment. Resources were limited, and people often had to make do with what they could find or create from natural materials. The story of these bug-ridden beds serves as a reminder that the Wild West was not just a land of adventure and opportunity, but also a place of hardship and discomfort. Even the most basic necessities, like a comfortable and pest-free bed, were often out of reach for many. By understanding the challenges faced by those who lived in the Wild West, we gain a deeper appreciation for their resilience and adaptability. If you could travel back in time to the Wild West, what hygiene item would you bring with you, and why? Whiskey as a meal and a cure-all. The Wild West, often portrayed as a land of hearty meals and campfire feasts, also harbored a reality where food was scarce and diets were often monotonous. For pioneers and cowboys on the move, access to fresh ingredients and proper cooking facilities was limited. In this context, whiskey sometimes became more than just a drink. It served as a meal replacement and even a supposed cure-all. Imagine a group of cowboys on a cattle drive, their days filled with long hours under the scorching sun and dusty trails. At the end of a grueling day, they gather around a campfire, their stomachs rumbling. But instead of a hearty stew or a plate of beans, they reach for a bottle of whiskey. In the Wild West, whiskey was often consumed in place of a meal, particularly when food was scarce or time was of the essence. Its high alcohol content provided a temporary sense of fullness and warmth, masking the pangs of hunger and offering a quick source of calories. However, relying on whiskey as a meal replacement had its drawbacks. While it provided some energy, it lacked the essential nutrients needed for sustained health and well-being. Long-term reliance on whiskey could lead to malnutrition and other health problems. Beyond its role as a meal substitute, whiskey was also seen as a cure-all for various ailments. People used it to treat everything from colds and coughs to snake bites and gunshot wounds. While alcohol does have some antiseptic properties, its effectiveness as a medicine was often exaggerated. The practice of using whiskey as a meal and a cure-all highlights the resourcefulness and adaptability of those living in the Wild West. In a world where food and medical supplies were often scarce, people had to find ways to make do with what they had. However, it's important to remember that these practices were often born out of necessity rather than choice. The lack of access to proper nutrition and healthcare contributed to a high rate of illness and mortality in the Wild West. The story of whiskey's role in the Wild West serves as a reminder of the challenges faced by those who lived on the frontier. It also highlights the importance of access to nutritious food and proper medical care in promoting health and well-being. The next time you sit down to a well-balanced meal, take a moment to appreciate the abundance and variety of food we have available today, and remember the pioneers and cowboys of the Wild West who, despite facing hardship and deprivation, found ways to survive and persevere in a challenging environment. Saloon hygiene, or lack thereof. The Wild West Saloon, a place of legendary tales where cowboys gathered to gamble, drink, and swap stories after a long day on the trail. Hollywood often paints a romanticized picture of these establishments, filled with raucous laughter, swinging saloon doors, and the clinking of glasses. However, beneath the veneer of adventure and camaraderie lurked a less glamorous reality, a world where hygiene was an afterthought and sanitation standards were practically non-existent. Imagine stepping into a typical Wild West saloon. The air hangs thick with the smell of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and unwashed bodies. The dimly lit space is crowded with patrons from all walks of life, their voices a cacophony of shouts, laughter, and drunken arguments. As you approach the bar, you're greeted by the sight of a seemingly endless row of bottles filled with a variety of liquors. But beware, for not all that glitters is gold in the Wild West Saloon. Many establishments served a notorious concoction known as rotgut whiskey. This potent brew, often made from a mixture of low-quality alcohol, burnt sugar, and other questionable ingredients, was notorious for its harsh taste and unpredictable effects. Drinking rotgut could leave you with a splitting headache, an upset stomach, or even worse. As you lean against the bar, you might notice a towel hanging conveniently within reach. Its purpose, ostensibly, is to provide patrons with a way to wipe their beer-soaked beards or spilled drinks. But beneath this seemingly innocuous facade lies a hidden danger. These communal towels, rarely washed and used by countless individuals, became breeding grounds for bacteria and germs. Each wipe could potentially transfer a host of unseen pathogens, spreading illness and infection among the saloon's patrons. The lack of hygiene in Wild West saloons reflected the broader sanitation challenges of the era. Access to clean water and proper sanitation facilities was limited, particularly in remote frontier towns. This, combined with a general lack of awareness about the importance of hygiene, created an environment where germs and diseases could thrive. The story of saloon hygiene, or lack thereof, offers a sobering reminder that the Wild West was not all glamour and adventure. It was a time when basic necessities like clean water and sanitation were often scarce, and where the pursuit of pleasure and profit sometimes came at the expense of public health. By understanding the less savory aspects of this era, we gain a more complete and nuanced understanding of the challenges faced by those who lived and worked in the Wild West. Unconventional medicines. The Wild West, often romanticized as a land of adventure and freedom, also harbored a harsh reality where disease and injury were commonplace. Limited access to health care and a lack of understanding about germs and sanitation created a challenging environment for those who braved the frontier. In this context, pioneers and settlers often turned to unconventional medicines and remedies to treat their ailments. Imagine a cowboy with a throbbing toothache. His options for relief are limited, and a visit to a dentist is likely out of the question. So, he reaches for a bottle of toothache drops, a popular remedy in the 1880s. But these aren't your ordinary toothache drops. They contain a surprising ingredient: cocaine. Yes, you heard that right. Cocaine, now recognized as a highly addictive and dangerous drug, was once a common ingredient in over-the-counter medications, including toothache drops. Its numbing properties provided temporary relief from dental pain, offering a welcome respite in a time when dental care was rudimentary at best. Cocaine wasn't the only unconventional medicine used in the Wild West. Other remedies included laudanum. This opium-based tincture was used to treat a variety of ailments, from pain and coughs to diarrhea and insomnia. However, its highly addictive nature often led to dependence and other serious health problems. Mercury. This toxic metal was used to treat syphilis and other infections. However, its side effects could be severe, including neurological damage and even death. Arsenic. Believe it or not, arsenic was used as a tonic and a treatment for various illnesses. However, its highly poisonous nature made it a dangerous remedy. Aspirin. This now common pain reliever was first synthesized in the late 19th century and quickly gained popularity as a safer alternative to other pain-relieving drugs. The use of these unconventional medicines highlights the desperation and limited options available to those living in the Wild West. In a world where disease was rampant and access to qualified medical care was scarce, people often turned to whatever remedies they could find, regardless of their potential risks. The story of these medicines also underscores the importance of scientific advancements in medicine and the development of safer and more effective treatments. The next time you reach for a bottle of aspirin, take a moment to appreciate the progress we've made in understanding the human body and developing treatments that improve our health and well-being. The West was wild, sure, but not quite the way we remember it. Which myth surprised you most? Let us know below. And if you enjoyed the ride, like, subscribe, and don't forget to tap the bell for future trails ahead.